Hi there, welcome to the Dan Cave and welcome to part 2 of the Airfix Bristol Blenheim Mk.IV build in 72nd scale. So in this part I'm going to cover basically assembly of the cockpit, getting that forward fuselage kind of number of pieces together and the glazing parts together and get that attached to the main kind of wing and fuselage part, and then proceed on to get the control surfaces onto the kit. So that's what I'm going to cover today. I think the video runs at just under 30 minutes, so not a huge amount today, but certainly, you know, there's a lot of work in there. A lot of gluing, a lot of sanding, some more gluing, some more sanding, a little bit of filling, small amount of painting. But, you know, sit back, enjoy the video, put your feet up, have a coffee, have beer, whatever you want. So thanks to everyone who's liked and subscribed so far. If you've not done so, please drop a like, give a subscribe, drop a comment if you want. Ask me any questions about the build or just anything in general. But anyway, sit back and enjoy. So thank you everyone. I'll talk to you later.
And there we go. We're back into it. Back with the one-handed man with a bunch of cockpit parts. Oh no, there we go. There's the other hand. So all these parts were cleared off the removed from a sprue a little bit earlier. I did forget to start the camera, but they've all been cleaned up, and now I'm just using a little bit of Tamiya extra thin to begin that assembly. So the plan for this is I'm basically going to assemble nearly all the cockpit parts, or certainly the major kind of sub-assemblies, and it'll all be painted as assembled parts. Sometimes that just works a little bit easier, saves having to mount and spray, you know, 10 or 12 different parts. Kind of reduces that to 3 or 4 parts. So as is usual, just using the extra thin, just to use its capillary action to run in around the join lines. To the cockpit in this, it's not hugely detailed, but is a reasonable representation of the kind of framework that goes around the seat itself, the little round seat for the bombardier, which you can see me just gluing on now. Also my head ever so briefly in shot. So that just sits nicely in this little place, a little touch of extra thin. And now just adding in the control column. So when I looked at the kind of clear parts, they're reasonably well manufactured, but you know, they do distort a little bit, so you're not going to see a huge amount of detail through the windows. Once the framing's all painted up, they're not going to be the clearest, but you will see a bit. So it is important to certainly get at least the color palette represented correctly for the cockpit, if maybe not the kind of absolute levels of detail. So here I've just realized I've forgotten there's one little small part which sits on the right hand side of the seat, which I think has got some of the trim controls on it. So then there's the bombardier bomb aimer's seat, which goes just in front of the very forward glass pieces, which I guess that's where the bomb aimer would sit and aim. So that's getting assembled to the fuselage wall, and again with a little bit of extra thin. So once all those parts are together, they're all going to get airbrushed in the same extra acrylic interior green that I used previously for bomb base and the landing gear base. So again, for me, the extra acrylic, it does spray quite nicely for me. I've never had much trouble with it. Running about 18 psi, and I think on this occasion I didn't even thin it. It's pretty much straight from the bottle. So again, with the kind of main cockpit parts, it's all about kind of getting in around the angles, because there's a lot of kind of awkward little spots to get to. Again, constantly moving the spray, move the target a little bit, moving it around, make sure we get into all those little angles and nooks and crannies. So overall, yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. It's a good, nice coat of green. So the next step is the seats are getting painted with Revell Aqua leather. I can't remember which number it is, but it's basically a kind of reddish brown leather color, and that'll do the seats. So there's the main pilot seat, and I'm guessing it's a little fold down seat for a bombardier. Again, this is where I do overpaint a little bit and start to paint the bottom part, but then realize that that actually isn't leather, and that's where the pilot would probably sit on his parachute pack. So there's a couple of other little components get painted that same leather color. So I'm just using a fine brush just to pick out those particular colors. And then the same for the bomb aimer seat or couch or tray or whatever it's called. So once this particular color is complete, we'll now move on to a matte black color just to pick out any, well, the control column, any of the pertinent details around, boxes on the side consoles where there are radio boxes or control boxes, things like throttle assemblies. So they are reasonably well represented in this scale with sidewall detail, and I'll just pick them out with the black paint. So as is usual, it's a fairly straightforward task. Again, it's just make sure that there's not too much paint loaded on the brush. You don't want it to flood the area, and then just carefully run around the parts you need. So now I'm just using a very small amount of white paint just to simulate the addition of little details, whether it's switches or placards, just to give that impression of some detail in the cockpit. Once I'm happy that all that's done, I'm using I suppose a mid-grey color. I can't remember which number. I'm just using that to dry brush pretty much all the parts in the cockpit, and that just helps highlight the kind of raised areas. So dry brushing technique, it's an old paintbrush. You put a drop of paint on the end of it, and then wipe off pretty much as you can until it's leaving almost no trace of paint on the kitchen roll I'm using, and then you just brush it over the surface, and you'll gradually see that will deposit some paint. So once I'm happy with that kind of highlighting with the dry brushing, I've sharpened a cocktail stick, and I'm using that now to add one or two little silver scratches, basically to simulate the chipping of paint. Again, fairly random in nature, just go around trying to pick out any, edges that are obvious that, that would get worn by kind of the flight crew going in and out of the aircraft, in and around the pilot seat, just the base of the seat, in and around the edges. Again, as the transparent parts are not that clear, you're unlikely to see much in terms of real detail. But again, just to give that impression of that chipped paint when you do look through. So that's also applied along the fuselage walls. So this gives, I suppose, an impression if that's the area where, the bomb aimer will go kind of forward and back to his seat during the flight. Will be a kind of high traffic, high weathered area, so it is likely to see some chipping in those areas. So again, around any control consoles, a further little bit of chipping is added. So while that's all drying, it's time to start getting those clear parts off the sprue. So they've been kind of nicely sealed away in their own little protective bag until now. So again, coming off the sprue, and I'm using a sharp scalpel blade just to clean up the sprue attachment points. So the interior bits are nicely dried. So now I'm going to go back with an ammo interior wash, which is basically a dark green wash. And that's going to be used around all the cockpit areas just to add a little bit of depth to the recessed areas. So it's used to run in around kind of all those recesses, but also on any of the flat bits. It can be used to add a little bit of kind of filtering effect to give some of that kind of color variation to the interior green. So on the side walls, there is some kind of fuselage frame detail. So we'll use that interior wash just to sit in the recesses and try and highlight those frames. So again, I'm using basically a liner brush. So it's a reasonably kind of pointed brush, but it's quite long, so it actually can hold quite a lot of paint. So that's quite useful for doing washes. Kind of allows the point and then allows the paint to flow off the brush. So once I'm happy with the amount of kind of wash I've put down and it's left to dry for a little bit, the next step is to go back with some odorless thinners, basically moisten the brush with some odorless thinners and use that to kind of help soak up any excess, dabbing it constantly on the kitchen towel just to make sure there's not too much on the brush, and then use that to mop up where we want, but also to move some of that kind of wash color around a little bit, trying to kind of blend the effect as well. So it's not just basically a panel line wash. There's a little bit of kind of color variation added to each area. So once that's all done, there's the nice task of masking all the glazed areas. So for this, I'm basically using some large pieces of masking tape, burnishing it down onto the clear part, and then using a pencil to kind of highlight where the frame lines are. Once I've pencil marked all those frame lines, I'm using a sharp scalpel blade basically to score out around the masking tape. And that, if done accurately, should in theory leave me with a perfect mask over the clear parts. And when I pull back the masking tape, we'll just have the frames left exposed, and they'll of course get painted later on in the process. So on a canopy like this, I'm sure there's probably masks available, pre-cut masks. They can be quite useful. I quite enjoy doing this method. A little bit of time and patience, and yeah, it's relatively straightforward to do. So once everything is kind of scored completely, we can start pulling off the excess masking tape. Sometimes we'll get corners will stay behind, so you'll need to go back with the scalpel just to nip them. But as you can see, as I pull off that masking tape, carefully checking, there we go, just another little piece we need to just cut through. And then hopefully all of that should come off. And then we're left with basically a neatly masked canopy area. So just the right hand side is done at the moment. We'll now basically reuse that piece of tape and repeat the process on the left hand side. So same process, mark it all out in pencil, score around the pencil marks with the scalpel blade, and then we should be able to easily remove the excess tape and just leave behind the parts we want masked. So it'll work exactly the same process around all the kind of glazed parts that need masking. It is relatively time consuming, but for me it's I don't know, relatively therapeutic, and I quite enjoy it. So now we've completed all the masking. Happy that the wash is dried in the cockpit parts. We can start assembling the nose cockpit area. So having looked at kind of other builds of this, I've seen some people have basically assembled the two kind of lower front fuselage parts and then attached that to the main part of the fuselage and then added the glazing. I've decided to basically follow the instructions on this occasion, and I'll basically just glue the two fuselage halves together with all the cockpit parts in. I'll then add in all the glazed parts, and then I'll attach it to the main part of the fuselage. Now, I think for me, I think that sequence of steps is probably the best way to get the glazed parts lined up properly. Because I think if you attach the fuselage parts, the front fuselage to the main fuselage first, I think you run the risk of having more possibility of a misalignment, which will be much more obvious on the clear parts and much harder to deal with. Because obviously if you have to sand in that area, you then need to try and polish up any damaged areas. So now I've got the two halves together using a bit of Tamiya Extra Thin just to glue them together. The two side windows are already in place. That Extra Thin is the quick setting one, so it does actually set rather rapidly. Once I'm happy with that, I can then lay the top clear part on the very top, and so far so good. The fit looks pretty good around those clear areas. So a bit of careful application of Extra Thin works just fine, and then we're just left with the very forward kind of nose clear parts, which I guess is where the bomb aimer will sit. So once again, a little bit of Extra Thin to run into that join line, and everything sits nicely together. So as one complete sub-assembly, I think this actually works quite well. The fit is good. There's a bit of a seam to deal with on the underside, but the glazed parts, which I think were the more important ones, do fit quite well. So now I'm just kind of squaring off as much as I can the attachment point for this, dry fitting it, and this is where probably the one issue area that I've found so far, or one problem area. The fit is not great here, and as I said earlier, I think if you just attach the lower fuselage parts on their own, I think you'd be able to get a better fit in this area, but I think the consequence is some of the glazing won't fit very well. But anyway, we will adjust as we go. Use a scalpel to clear some excess plastic, kind of try to flatten back that join as well, using a sanding block, and I've got it to where I think it's reasonably acceptable. So once again, the Tamiya Extra Thin quick setting is used. So that's run into the join, top and bottom, and across where the glazed parts meet as well. So I end up just holding that for about 20 to 30 seconds. I'm absolutely happy with that. So that's left to cure for, well, we say give or take 12 hours. And now I'm going back and using a bit of sprue goo. Now you may ask, what is that? Well, that's basically a little bit of Tamiya Extra Thin with some excess sprue plastic just dropped into it. And that essentially just melts it into basically a plastic messy goo, and it's an excellent filling material. So the stuff I've got here is fairly thick. I find it quite useful for filling in small seam lines. Essentially, the Tamiya Extra Thin in there will make that plastic bond to the model like it's two plastic parts. It's a very good way to get rid of troublesome seam lines. The downside is it can take a long time to cure, particularly if it's a deep area. You could be talking, days in some cases. However, I think because it's quite a thin coat, I've left it about 24 hours and it's all dried and absolutely fine. So I'm using a combination of UMP thinny sticks and sanders, and a UMP customizable sander to cut off a small strip, which will be quite useful for getting into the more awkward areas. So it's the usual sanding process, kind of working through the grades, knocking back with the coarse grades, and then just refining the area with progressively finer and finer grades of sanders. So this is where the UMP customizables come into their own, really. They're extremely handy for awkward little tight spots. Just cut them to size. Very useful for getting into tight little spots for sanding. However, for the majority of this, I'm starting with I think it's a 220 or 180. Really bad with remembering, but certainly the coarsest grade of thinny stick that I've got. So once I'm happy with all that, it's just a quick job to go around and restore any lost panel lines. Scriber also helps remove any of the sanding dust. So when I was looking over the model, I realised that the wing fuselage kind of root join was not quite right. And so when I say that, basically there is supposed to be a step here. The wing grid fillet, basically that part would overlap the skin surface, but it just looked a little bit too excessive. So a little bit of work with the sanders just knocks that down a little bit, gets it back to something that's a little bit more realistic looking and certainly more comparable to where it kind of joins the side of the fuselage. So that kind of height of step is around the same. So same process, starting with a coarse grade, working way up to a finer grade. So once I'm happy with all that, out with the obligatory makeup brush donated by my wife. And that's then used just to clean off any excess dust. So now we can move on to adding the control surfaces. To the elevator's rudders and ailerons are all posable. However, for me, they'll just sit in a neutral position. So it's the usual process: clip them off the sprue, clean up any attachment points, check for any noticeable seam lines, and I'm using the sponge sander just to clean up those seam areas. So I suppose it's one of the flaws with these components. There's no real positive attachment. They do sit quite nicely. They sit reasonably flush. Not a horrendous representation, but they can be misaligned slightly because there's no real positive locating pins or tabs. So it's a case of kind of gluing them and just checking that alignment, making sure I'm happy with it. So the horizontal tailplane elevators are done, and then the rudder is basically balanced on the top of the rear fuselage, and a couple of drops of extra thin just run into that join line again, and I'm happy with that. So horizontal tailplanes basically sit in recesses in the aft fuselage. Reasonably good kind of location. Again, it's not a very kind of positive way to locate them. It can be quite sloppy. So again, you're kind of relying on that kind of working time of the glue to give you that manipulation time. However, I get out a little bit of one of a small plastic set square and use that to basically eyeball up that I'm happy with that alignment. To my eyes, it looks reasonably correct. Looks pretty kind of bang on straight to me. So next up, there's the ailerons for each wing. Going to follow the same process, remove any kind of sprue attachment points, use the sponge sander to get rid of any noticeable seam lines. Then do a test fit, see how that slots in. Looks a little bit tight, and just checking there is a seam line on the inside edge, and I'm using a homemade sanding block basically to flatten that off. That slots in place, and a little bit of extra thin secures that to the model. Again, definitely from the upper side, it looks like a good tight fit, not much of a seam line there at all. And then the final set of components are the flaps. These are again posable, so I've decided to pose them in the down position. Kind of adds that, I suppose, level of kind of interest to what's on the underside. There is a little bit of rib detail as well. And we'll just use the extra thin on the attachment points, and they'll be secured absolutely fine. So that pretty much brings us to the end of part 2. All major bits assembled. So we'll head on back over to me for the final ramblings and thoughts and witterings on about things. Over to me.
So there we go. That was part 2 of the build series of the Bristol Blenheim. I hope you've enjoyed it. So we covered getting the cockpit together. Not a huge amount of detail in there, and particularly when you kind of look at the clear parts, you're not going to see a lot through those clear parts. So not a huge amount of detail is needed, but a little bit of work was done. We've done a little bit of painting, some washing on it. Added a little bit of, you know, kind of silver kind of scratching to give that kind of paint chipping effect. And you know, we've stuck in a couple of seat belts made simply from masking tape. So a couple of little things that just add that little bit of interest for what you will be able to see through the clear parts. So obviously, as we saw during the video, the fit of that kind of forward fuselage section onto the main part was not brilliant. Probably the first kind of real kind of weak area I've seen in this kit, and that maybe kind of came from kind of getting it together in one piece to make sure that the clear parts actually lined up, because you've essentially got, you know, 4 clear parts that need to kind of sit closely together, which, you know, kind of helps with probably painting them if you wanted to keep them separate, but maybe, and probably, you know, was necessary just because the shapes and stuff would be hard to mold otherwise. But I think you may have gotten a better fit to the forward fuselage if you just used the 2 bottom kind of sections and attached them directly onto the fuselage, but that may have compromised the fit of the clear parts, which I think would have been more noticeable if it was done that way and the clear parts didn't fit. So I think we've done the right way. A little bit of kind of filling on that just to improve it, but not a huge amount compared to, you know, what our kits have built. So, you know, reasonably pleased with that progress. So now we've got basically overall a almost complete airframe. So in the next part, so we are getting closer to the kind of priming and painting stage. However, we're not there yet. So the next part, probably going to look at doing the engine, landing gear, but then also getting out all those kind of additional bits that will need kind of the overall paint scheme applied. So the engine cowlings, get them done, bomb bay doors, landing gear doors, that kind of stuff. And hopefully by the end of the next part, we'll be up to the point where we can start the priming and paint stage. And that'll be it. So hopefully part 3 will be out in a week or so's time, depending on how much bench time I get. However, you know, progress is what it is, so I'm kind of compiling these as I do the work. So if I don't get time to make progress, unfortunately it does delay the videos a little bit. So unfortunately I do have to work for a living as well as do modelling, so it can slow them down a little bit, but hopefully it should be about a week or so we'll have another part out. So thank you everyone for watching. Thank you for sitting and listening to me droning on for the last close to 30 minutes, I think. And hopefully if you've liked the video, you'll pop a like in. Even if you don't like it, you know, at least leave a comment, let me know why. If you can, please give a subscribe, every little helps. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you all soon, which I think will be probably a bench update at some point in the coming days. But if not for that, then at least come back for part 3 of this. So stick with it, we'll get to the end eventually. So thank you everyone, and see you all soon. Bye bye.